Morning Foresters. We're going to finish off this week with day 15, which is May 29th already, if you can believe it. And today's focus is going to be on some of the human resource aspects of it. Just like we have air resources, water resources, vegetation, wildlife, etc. We have a human and cultural side to that as well. So like archaeological sites, cultural traces and remains, burial sites, and in some cases, contemporary or modern uses of forest ecosystems for reasons and cultural practices other than what you and I may be accustomed to here in kind of southern Illinois, rural Midwest, that sort of thing. So things like traditional uses of Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for traditional caribou hunting by Native Alaskans and so forth. This is a real thing. This really governs a lot of things in terms of wildlife dynamics, in terms of the spiritual and religious practices of a lot of people. Native Hawaiians, for example, still use Haleakala Summit and the crater there, one of our case studies, for religious practices. A lot of their royalty are buried there. So we will go through those and then kind of jump from those into kind of how the mind of a visitor tends to work. We want to speak in generalities here because, again, forest recreation management is less about facilitating a specific and individual recreation experience. We have a whole other major for that, outdoor recreation, and they do a great job. But for us, where we have to manage millions of visitors a year and hundreds of millions of visits per year across just the National Park Service, but also just across the U.S. Forest Service and just across Fish and Wildlife, right? There are hundreds and hundreds of millions of people visiting different places, different times throughout the year. So we need to understand a little bit about how people tend to think when they're in wildland spaces, when they're in forested environments, and what that tends to lead them to do. So this isn't good or bad, it's just kind of how some brains tend to work. And we'll use that and always think about this in the context of multiplying it up against millions of people doing the same thing every year. And although some of our busiest parks in the United States, like Great Smoky Mountains National Park, see about 6 to 6.5 million visitors a year, which is a lot in a relatively small space. Great Smoky Mountains National Park, the section of the Appalachian Trail that goes through it is only about 70 miles long. It's not that big of a space, but lots and lots of people, multiple times the size of St. Louis, visiting there every year. And not all across the year evenly spaced, mostly just in those summer months. So it's 6.5 million people doing a lot of stuff in a short period of time. But imagine that multiplied up again with some international national parks that have just been set up in kind of the past 10 to 15 years, where in China, for example, in year 1 and 2 of a recently opened national park that John Groniger visited a couple years ago, they had over 20 million visits per year. And that's the entire population of not just New York City, but the greater New York area, like into Pennsylvania and into New Jersey and Connecticut and all these other sort of collar states around New York. So we got to think about what people think about and how they think about it and kind of why they think about it in these forest recreation contexts, because even a small effect from each one multiplied against millions or tens of millions of visits every single year can have some pretty drastic effects. So that's kind of the second half of today's work, to think a little bit about visitor cognitive processes. I'll post up some examples of what that looks like. So we don't necessarily want to just manage behaviors of people. That would be like giving people a slap on the wrist for trying to steal something. We want to try and connect with them before they reach that point where they're having some sort of, hopefully, a thought process on, why should I do what I'm about to do? Why do I think this is a good thing? What's my motivation? Okay, so today we're going to crawl into the strange and wonderful mind of the most bizarre wildlife species, the human being. Enjoy, and we'll see you this afternoon for our Zoom debrief.